Last moment for the press. Good afternoon. My name is Anja Skrzypek. I'm Director for Research and Training, and it will be my privilege to moderate this afternoon's discussion, which is the third time we meet to discuss a very important book. But before I get into any of that, I would like to ask Dr. Laszlo Andor, FEPS Secretary General, who is one of the book's editor, to say a few words about the book and the process that led to its creation.
Good afternoon from me as well. On behalf of FEPS, I also welcome you to this important occasion. Indeed, we celebrate a book, and some of the authors have been kind enough to travel to Brussels and to attend this discussion. But let me start with the statement that 2022 was probably the most dramatic year of our lives. That a war at this scale, after the Russian aggression against Ukraine returning to Europe, is something which is changing European politics, society, with obviously the most dramatic consequences on the society of Ukraine itself. So that's the starting point, which obviously put the work of FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, on a new track about 18 months ago. And we also wanted to join the expert community, which provided explanation, insight about what has been happening, but also what might be the outcome of this and how European integration is going to be impacted by these dramatic and tragic developments. Let me also state that FEPS was not entirely new in the territory of studying Eastern policy of the European Union. We had already in the years before a project which looked into EU-Russia relations, but as soon as the aggression against Ukraine took place, we transformed this project into one looking into the course of developments in Ukraine and the wider context of this conflict. And I think this book is a testimony of the really wide context, which is necessary to be understood if we want to return to a more constructive, more sustainable and sound Eastern policy of the European Union. So if not before, I think it was understood in February 2022 that the so-called old Eastern policy of the EU was gone. But how we arrive to a new one requires a very thorough analysis from many dimensions. Let me also highlight that in this last 18 months, we also benefited from a number of exchanges with EU officials. In this room, for example, Josep Borrell, the High Representative and Vice President of the European Commission, was present with us in a discussion. Some of the authors also participated in this, and that also gave a boost to our deeper studies of the situation and the new concept of EU security policy. The work on this specific book started a little bit more than 1 year ago. And we obviously praise our cooperation with LPP, the London Publishing Partnership, which produced the book after the manuscript was ready. Together with my co-editor, Uwe Optenhögel, we are grateful for all the authors who delivered their specific chapters on different aspects of the war. And before handing over the stage to the authors themselves, there's just one more thing I would like to highlight already in the introduction, that FEPS is also working on another book under the leadership of a renowned international relations expert, Dr. Giovanni Grevi. And this book, which is more looking into the longer-term implications of the war in Ukraine, or the war against Ukraine, more precisely, is going to be published in the next 1 month. So very shortly, I believe we will have an opportunity to invite you back to discuss this volume again. So thank you for the opportunity, and I wish everybody a very good discussion about the content.
Thank you very much, Laszlo, and thank you for also showing how much of an intellectual and political journey it was to put this book together. The book came first time into the public light exactly 1 year after the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And the book is monumental because it actually analyzes not only the context and the need for the new Eastern policy, as you said, but it also asks the question not only if, but also how. It looks at the cost, the socio-economic, political costs of the war. It looks at geopolitical context, which we will be addressing just in a moment. But it also looks at the way forward, which is a great part of the 21 chapters that you are going to see. I think the book is challenging for any reader also because the book provides timeline, not allowing us to forget about any atrocities of the war and things that happen and things that have been achieved. As also the book provides glossary, which is something that, you know, might be a nuance, but contrary to that is the instrumental thing to help us think about what has been happening and the way forward in a profoundly important manner. Now, I have been asked, because this is just 1 hour conversation, we have 4 speakers, so I have to be keeping everybody incredibly disciplined, but I have been asked also to start this conversation by asking actually everybody who have arrived, and we're incredibly grateful for your participation, a very short question, which I understood had been asked on the stopovers to promote this book already before, definitely in Stockholm, and the book was also promoted in Budapest. We are looking at 2 more events in the capitals of Vienna and Helsinki. And the question would be, and this is not up for the discussion, so if you would have an appetite for the secondary question, it's not allowed at this stage. I will be very strict about that. The question is going to be displayed just behind me in a moment, and it reads, since the start of the Russians' full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has the EU performed better or worse? Now, since it's an or question, and we don't have Slido, we are not going to use the electronic devices to answer, I would like to ask all those of you who think that the EU performed worse than expected, to raise your hands. 1. Abstentions are, of course, always possible, but I would go right away for the second alternative. Who thinks that the EU performed better than expected? I do still see some abstentions in the room, but I think it's an overwhelming majority for the second answer. I will allow that to be contemplated for a moment, and I would like to start by introducing the first of the panelists and author of the book, who, as Laszlo mentioned, had also been a part of this initiative since the beginning, since actually we started discussing about the need for the new Eastern policy in very different geopolitical context. Professor Andre Heric, professor from University of Leiden, member of the FEPS Scientific Council, our beloved speaker when it comes to the discussions about not only Ukraine but also Belarus, very many debates you've taken with us at FEPS. Now we are meeting in very different circumstances, and I would like to challenge you to be the first one to give us a little bit of a context and not to make the issue too complex and too challenging. You have, of course, 4 minutes.
4 minutes?
I'm being generous today.
Okay, better but not good enough. 4 minutes. Yes, so I wrote a piece. Good afternoon, thank you for having me. I wrote a piece in the book on Putin's, if you like, philosophical and ideological, philosophical roots of his thinking. I'm not going to repeat my argument in the book. I'm going to focus on something else, and that is Russia's disengagement from Europe. Russia has closed the window on Europe. And my question is, what does that actually mean? What does it mean for Russia? What does it mean for Europe? What does it mean for security in Europe? I'm writing a piece on this very same topic together with Reinhard Krum, who is the FEPS representative in the Baltic states. And I must be honest, I have far from ready answers to all of the questions that I'm going to pose. So my idea is essentially to pick your brains rather than to give you a full presentation. Now, let me start by sketching the situation. Political consensus is not a free choice in Russia today, as we all know, but I do believe that there is, at least among the political class, the shared belief that there are few other options but to turn away from Europe. This choice, it's a political choice, has of course partially been enforced by the West because we have turned away from Russia. The current sanctions regime is unprecedented. Never before has any state, perhaps not suffered, but has any state been forced to live under a sanctions regime which is comparable to the one that we initiated 2 years ago after Russia attacked Ukraine. Europe has always played a very important role in Russia's history, in Russia's self-perception, and as our argument goes is Russia has closed the window on Europe more than it has ever done before. Secondly, Russia has closed the window on Europe and legitimized it theoretically. I'm going to talk about Russia, I'm not going to talk about Ukraine in this short presentation. It has legitimized it theoretically based on the perceived unique and superior nature of its own civilization. And finally, which is probably the most important aspect of this turning away from Europe, is that for the first time in history, because it has happened before, right? Russia's relations with Europe have always been a history of attraction and rejection. But for the first time in history, Russia claims to have an alternative to Europe, a geopolitical alternative. And that's obviously the East, East Asia, South Asia, Asia in general. Now, what does this rejection of Europe, this closing its window on Europe, what does it mean for Russia? What does it mean for us? Very, very briefly. Russia is engaged, the Putin leadership and Russia's talking heads are engaged in a sort of civilizational discourse. A discourse which says, which is not unique for Russia. You can see the very same thing in China happening and to a lesser extent in the United States as well. Russia comes close to what a British scholar, Christopher Cooker, a couple of years ago defined as a civilizational state. Putin actually copies this terminology. Russia is more than a state, Russia is a civilizational state. And Russia is a civilizational state under pressure. The political talking heads in Russia, including Putin himself, permanently refer to a beleaguered Russia, a fortress Russia. Now, to cope with that element of siege, Putin has selected two different options. One is his Greater Eurasia thing, which are two things at the very same time. It's a strategy of actual integration, largely failed thus far, but it's more than that. It's also an ideological construct. Greater Eurasia is Putin's regional power base, and he needs that regional power base to play the global role of a great power. So the Greater Eurasia argument by Putin includes both his aspiration to reintegrate Russia and the post-Soviet space, to rationalize Russia's break with the West, and to create a local sphere of influence, which is a precondition for his role, Russia's role as a global power. This element of Eurasia is an important aspect of his turning away from Europe, his closing a window on Europe. And most of the intellectuals, so the talking heads, as I call them, the IR specialists, which are still in Russia today, share this discourse. The inevitability of turning away from Europe as a precondition also for turning east. As I said, the most important difference from earlier attempts by Russia to turn away from the West is that it claims to have an alternative in the East. But the East has meanwhile changed. Russia enters a different type of Asia. Obviously, Russia has made earlier shifts, partial shifts to Asia. But Russia now enters Asia not as a superior power, but as an inferior one. Inferior to some of the larger powers in Asia itself. India perhaps, but certainly China. So as far as that is concerned, this shift to the east, which we're going to answer in much more detail in our article, in the article that we're working on, harbors a lot of uncertainties for Russia itself. My second question, what does it mean for Europe? Well, basically, I have to admit here my analysis stops, because I'm not sure yet what Russia's disengagement from Europe and turn to the East, what it actually means for Europe now and in the future. Let me end with two general statements. It's a platitude, I agree, and I quote now Kimmich and Lippmann in an article which they recently published in Foreign Affairs. It's a platitude indeed to say that no matter how the war between Ukraine and Russia develops, it will almost certainly leave in place a crucial new reality of 21st international relations. Most probably. I'm not absolutely sure, but most probably. But more important is another quote from a book published a couple of years ago by Mark Smith, the British Russia specialist Mark Smith, in a book called The Russia Anxiety. And he argues when Russia is out of sync with the international system, Europe as a whole is vulnerable. And this I consider as a sort of a warning for those among us, perhaps, who claim that Russia's move to the East, closing its window on Europe, is Russia's problem and not ours. Our point is, my point is, that potentially at least, it's also our problem, because it will have a deep impact on security in Europe as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Andre. I think if you look at the book, the chapters really show you the diverse aspects of changing geopolitical circumstances, and Andre referred to some of them, leaving us with a very existential question at the end. And because you've spoken about the Russia closing the window on Europe and looking at Asia and a different positioning of Russia in the Asian context, of course, China, we could go into this conversation. But I would like to actually turn in geographical direction and move to Jack Thompson, who's a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam. And in the book, you're going to find his thoughts about the inconsistent and changing policies of the US, which I think will complement the picture that Andre has just introduced us with. Jack, very much for joining. Thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours. Also 4 minutes.
Great. Thanks for the invitation to be here and for the opportunity to publish a chapter in the book. I'll make 3 points today.
Yeah.
First, U.S. grand strategy is undergoing arguably its most profound transition since the end of World War II, and this has had a big impact on the role the U.S. has played in the Russia-Ukrainian war. Most Americans recognize that the era of what has sometimes been called the U.S. liberal hegemony has ended. The U.S. is no longer the lone superpower operating in an international system that is at least partially designed for its own benefit, for the benefit of its allies. Instead, the Biden administration views itself as engaged in what it calls a strategic competition between autocracies and democracies to shape the new emerging system. Now, of course, competition with China is a foremost concern in this context, but the Russo-Ukrainian war is also at the very kind of front of this discussion. Now, the Biden administration is attempting to craft a grand strategy that essentially is an updated version of the grand strategy that we saw from the US during the Cold War and after 1990, which is multilateral, it's internationalist. Now, there are big questions about this grand strategy. Is it sustainable? Is it overly militarized? But I would argue it's probably the best, at least at this point, that we can expect from the US. That's point one. Point two, within the context of this strategic competition, the US views its support for Ukraine as an opportunity to inflict what it calls a strategic defeat on Moscow. It's been very explicit about this. A strategic defeat on Moscow by degrading the Russian military, and by keeping Russia bogged down in a war that it probably can't win. Now, I think, certainly for the Ukrainians, for many of us, the US approach to the Russia-Ukrainian war has been frustrating at times. It's been overly gradualist. For 15 years, it's given mixed messages to Ukraine about NATO membership. It's been slow to deliver key weapon systems, but it has also been essential to the Ukrainian effort, along with aid from Europeans and, of course, the bravery and skill of the Ukrainians themselves. So points 1 and 2 are kind of the good news part of my remarks. The bad news part comes in the third point I want to make, which is this internationalist, multilateralist strategy that the Biden administration is attempting to craft, could come to an end, could cease to function as early as next year. And one of the big reasons for this is what I refer to, is the impact of what I refer to as anti-Europeanism in U.S. grand strategy. What do I mean by this? Right now, public support for aiding Ukraine in the U.S. is at about 50-50. And all things considered, that's actually pretty good. But when you dig into those numbers, you see a very worrisome thing, which is that support for Ukraine has become a partisan issue. In other words, almost the entirety of that 50% that is skeptical about aid to Ukraine is Republican. And more specifically, it tends to be more nationalist and Trumpier. Now, everyone's seen the opinion polling, and it's clear that Donald Trump could absolutely win the election next year. And Donald Trump's version of grand strategy is not internationalist, it's not multilateral. It's a pernicious version of nationalism, which is designed to bolster illiberal democracy at home. So the last thing I'll say is that this discussion kind of intersects with a project that I'm working on right now, which examines the evolution and the impact of anti-Europeanism on US grand strategy throughout history. And one of kind of the big initial findings in this project is that we're seeing right now kind of a big resurgence of a particularly pernicious version of anti-Europeanism. Kind of began slowly in the 1990s, really picked up pace in the late 2000s, the early 2010s. And it's really kind of the highest, the most intense that we've seen since the 1930s. Now, right now, the war in Ukraine is kind of the focal point for this anti-Europeanism that we're seeing in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. grand strategy. But it's definitely spreading to other aspects of U.S. grand strategy. And I think it's here to stay. And this is something it's bad for the transatlantic relationship and should certainly be worrisome for Europeans. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of difficult questions that have been posed by Andre and Jack, and Ireneusz Bio, director of Amicus Europae, the foundation of President Kwaśniewski, an expert on the Eastern policies with lots of publications on the matter. You've returned recently from Kiev, but you're also in the midst of the ongoing campaign. And where Jack left us on was the question of support for the help for aid in Ukraine. You also spoke about the possible changing and inconsistent, I think is the title of your paper inside of the book, approach towards Europe and towards what's taking place after Russia's invasion on Ukraine. And when it comes to Poland, I think everybody had been reading different headlines, so I expect that the audience expects you to refer to also not only the article in the books, but also to that aspect. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book, I would like to sort of advertise at this stage that the book provides also the other aspects of geopolitical context, including BRICS, that today wasn't possible to include in the panel, but definitely you're welcome to have a look in that because it sort of complements the picture that the authors and the editors are trying to paint. Ireneusz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anya. Thank you very much for the invitation. Also, I'm very much obliged to Laszlo and Uwe for the kind invitation to prepare a chapter in the book. My chapter was devoted to the issue of the Polish Eastern policy, and also the question that Anya was posing in the beginning: how do I assess the effectiveness of the European Union to the reaction of the crisis? And it was not a surprise, I think, that I also voted in favor of yes, especially from the Polish perspective. It had a significant impact, and it was much better. Okay. Okay, now it works. Yes, much better. So I answered positive. A couple of points regarding the Polish Eastern policy, because I think it differed very much from the policy towards the East of the majority of the European Union countries. First of all, Poland was not surprised with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even more was prepared for the collapse of the Soviet Union in terms of how to approach the new nations that surfaced in the East. Of course, during communist time, it was absolutely forbidden for communist regimes to speak about any national divisions within the Soviet Union. But on the Polish immigration, there was a group called Polish Kultura,
based not far from Paris, in Maison Lafitte, who did all this intellectual work, how to approach the national ambitions of nations and countries in the East. Part of their intellectual heritage was also taken over by, for example, Zbigniew Brzeziński, who also one of his major lines of thoughts was, yes, that the Soviet Union's at the weakest, there where the national lines lie, and therefore the US should carry out a policy which should enforce and reinforce these fissures, these national divisions in the Soviet Union. But when, of course, 1991 happened, and from one day to the another, new countries have surfaced in the East, the new Polish government, after 1989, knew how to behave. There were no doubts whatsoever that Poland should accept the new borders, and also that the national ambitions of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, all the others, are absolutely legitimate, and we should support them. Therefore, Poland was the first country that supported the independence of Ukraine. It was not so much widespread in Western Europe. There was a famous book of a British historian who wrote, Andrew Wilson, who wrote a book entitled Ukrainians, an Unexpected Nation. So for us in Central Europe, especially in Poland, it was not an unexpected nation. It was something which we knew that there is, and of course we supported it very much. The history of Polish relations with Ukraine can be divided just very shortly in a couple of periods. First period, also in relation to the EU ambitions, was until 2004, the Orange Revolution. Because it was not surprising that Ukraine in the beginning identified themselves rather as a bridge between the East and the West than a part of the European integration project. Of course, they're very much attracted by the quality of life, by the institutions and many other aspects, but nevertheless, in terms, I think, both the society as political elites were seeing Ukraine as a bridge. 2004, of course, brought the Orange Revolution, and there was this nation-building process and the national identity. It made much more stronger to the surface. And I think from this point on, it went only stronger and stronger, with the period of Yanukovych trying to reverse the current of history, but of course it has not worked. So all these, what happened after 2004, then 2009, 2014, and finally 2022, was in the logic of a stronger and stronger national identity, more enmity towards Russia, that's what Andreas was speaking. And of course, finally, it ended in a military intervention. And now coming to that, Poland was also to a large extent surprised by the outbreak of the war. I know from personal relations and talks that it was not until a couple of weeks before the war that the Polish government and the Polish president started to treat seriously the warnings of the American and British intelligence about an imminent attack. They were not prepared for the number of refugees. It only started a couple of weeks before. So if we hear today that we always predicted that Polish government always knew that the Russians were planning this already in 2008 when Georgia was invaded, okay, let's treat it with a grain of salt, because of course there were also periods of pragmatical cooperation. We also hoped for a positive transition in Russia. We were also part of the reset process. We also launched initiatives like, for example, the small border traffic with Russia, which worked very well. So trying to do this Wandel durch Annäherung, trying to influence the Russian society that they understand that cooperation is possible. So it is not such a white-black as it is portrayed now. And now to the reaction of Poland and the current situation. The reaction of Poland, of course, was, I think, unprecedented, in our history at least. A huge eruption of solidarity, of support, especially people's support. Also the institutions, public institutions, despite we are not ready, we were able to allow over 8 million of Ukrainian refugees to come to Poland or through Poland, and help in any way that we could. But of course, and this is where I come to this question and the role of the European Union, the Polish abilities to handle the crisis were also limited. And at some point, we were overwhelmed by the row of problems. And here the European Union really reacted very, very quickly. Also, they are a key communitaire in this regard, especially the directive on temporary protection made wonders to help the Ukrainian refugees. And without that, it wouldn't be possible, I think, to really be so active. So not speaking about the sanctions, the political consensus, the European Peace Facility or the military assistance, the Leopard plans and so on, in terms even of the institutions and legal framework that there was, European Union really was able to help a lot to tackle the situation, help a lot to such countries like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania to tackle the crisis. So my answer is very much positive to this regard. I will stop here because I know that there could be some questions about now the current situation between Poland and Ukraine, but we will leave maybe for the other part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ireneusz. And if you allow me also to make the bridge with what Laszlo said at the very beginning, introducing the book, you also hosted us in Warsaw very much after the invasion. And thanks to your foundation, we were able to see actually how Polish organized themselves directly in Warsaw in March 2022 with the program Ones to Watch. I would like to also mention on that you've helped us understand the dynamic as seen from Polish perspective when it comes to the European Union actions and developments. There's much more in the book also about the question of security, defense, the army capacity that you will find in the different chapters. But you've also offered a bridge around how the neighborhood countries have been behaving and what it meant for them, and in the both multilateral and bilateral relations. And I think in the book you will also find a very interesting chapter about the Baltic states and what it meant for their dynamics. But what we haven't yet talked about, we talked about geopolitical context, West and East. We talked about the neighboring countries and the European Union. But of course, we haven't yet talked about what the war actually meant directly, what is the situation currently in Ukraine. And with that, I would like to move to Andrzej Korniczuk, who is our FEPS analyst for international relations, who contributed to the book with a chapter that focuses precisely on that. And this is part of the block where we discuss the socioeconomic, humanitarian, all different aspects of what society is going through. But also inside of the book, you will find very serious questions about the economic reconstruction of Ukraine, the perspective and what ceasefire would mean, and how one could imagine the end at the current given point. Andrzej, big responsibility for you to do in 4 minutes, quite impossible to bring us home and sort of be the grand finale of the first round of the presentation.
No, thank you, Anya. So I'll run quickly to the podium, saving some time. And if you talk about the responsibility, I think I'll use a lot of reference to other Ukrainian experts, intellectuals, and the wider community that well communicate about Ukraine. But I think my presence today and the fact that we have a strong Ukrainian representation speaks of the fact that the mantra, the slogan that Ukrainians try so hard to promote, that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, is actually becoming a common practice and something that is deeply ingrained. I think previously what we see, and what I try now to speak what was written in my chapter, is that the world actually rediscovered Ukraine. It rediscovered Ukraine, or discovered in some cases, as a sovereign state with a unique historical legacy, with a unique ethnocultural code, something that has not been seen only through the sort of Russian studies or through Russia as being this primary pillar that you try to project everything that is happening in Ukraine. So I think when it comes to book, there's excellent chapters written by Yulia Yurchenko, which Anya mentioned, on this economic cost for Ukraine, and Bogdan Ferenc, whose colleague are actually today in the audience from S&D platform, a good partner in Ukraine, who's trying also to put a view on a progressive sort of recovery and future of Ukraine that could definitely comment on. So this is a collective effort, but again, there's a strong representation of Ukrainian point of view in this book that hopefully gets important points across. So when it comes to rediscovery, I think this is a very key word. So I mentioned about the world rediscovering Ukraine. You can definitely see it from the basics until the presence is in media, but also on the international arena and the type of the presence that Ukraine currently has and its elites and its experts. But what would be perhaps overlooked is also that it led to rediscovery of Ukraine for the Ukrainians themselves. In the sense that we see nowadays the unprecedented levels of support for Ukraine, of course, for the European integration, for NATO membership, but rediscovery of the meaning what it is to be a nation or a political nation. This is definitely an important step in the birth of political nation as it is in Ukraine. So I think it's key to understand that. It's key to support Ukraine actually in this process because it's extremely painful. I mean, in expert or academic terms, very often the war is given as this important event, perhaps tragic event that allows the nation to come fully of age. Of course, Ukraine has faced wars throughout history in many instances. This is the first instance where it has so much support for the international community, when it is not left alone. So in that sense, I would just perhaps quote Alexei Haran, who speaks about grassroots Ukrainizations. And he defines it that as national values that are not being imposed by the government or political elites, but spread within and between people. And that is something that substantially also changed with the full-scale invasion, where this sort of national value spreading on the grassroots level has taken place. At the same time, I think what we should mention long term is the question how to support Ukraine democracy to being resilient and strong, because another Ukrainian intellectual, Ukrainian writer of Russian origin, Andrei Kurkov, he uses a very interesting term called democratic anarchy matrix, which describes the peculiarities actually of Ukrainian society and its democracy. And he puts it, I think, quite accurately in the following words. So Ukrainians are willing to participate in elections, and they fight for the victory of the candidate only to start fighting against him the next day. And so this shows you that some other people said that if it would be possible to export revolutions, Ukrainians would be leading the world as an expert community. This is a nation that is deeply has ingrained this hesitancy towards also authority. That is why this is a stark difference from what is happening in Russia. It's definitely couldn't be happening in Ukraine because there's this sort of strong hesitation to having a strong centralized power. But looking long term, what is important, of course, this deeply ingrained spirit of freedom and understanding that we are sort of as a community that has been fighting for this independence for centuries, actually. It is very important to remember that you need a strong social contract long term. And you cannot sort of go in this way where there's no social or weak social contract between the government and the society. So I think if to flag something that is as pertinent as before, it is still a matter of supporting Ukraine and understanding Ukraine, that Ukraine needs to have these instruments. It needs to build the ownership within its own sort of political elites and society to understand how to move forward together. So all these sacrifices, brave sacrifices that are being made, they're not futile. Another thing that I wanted to also quickly to flag and perhaps also making it my final point is the importance of the following. So very often you can hear, and I also heard it myself since 2014 when I did some research in eastern regions of Ukraine, which were temporarily occupied at the time, the focus that Ukraine is its people. We are over-fixated on the territory, and I do not here say that there should be any concessions on the territory. I rather want just to emphasize the importance of looking at the human capital of Ukraine, because you can win a war, but the question is what's coming next. Some of perhaps colleagues from Ukraine who are here might remember that in the 90s there was a very popular advertisement in Ukraine saying we are 52 million. Well, we are almost now half of that, and we don't know what will happen in a year or two time. This is a systemic, drastic change where Ukrainians, experts are already trying that the whole composition of demographic of Ukraine will change. This is, for instance, why the questions of gender-sensitive policies are no longer an option for Ukraine. It's an existential necessity to make sure it's incorporated in any types of support or recovery efforts, but going beyond that to make it also inclusive. So that understanding of how Europe should approach the millions of people that left Ukraine or temporarily are outside it, the questions of youth returning, and the questions of understanding Ukraine needs minds and hands to rebuild itself. If it wants to rebuild it, build itself better. It's a nice slogan, but you need someone to do it. It's not on paper. So, and in that sense, I think the labor shortages or the brain drain are simply those things that will be as important. And I will finish on that. So I think we are rightly so focusing a lot on the military support and state security, and perhaps even saying that Ukraine's democracy perhaps has no option but to be a militarized version of democracy. But at the same time, we certainly would make a grave mistake if we overlook the fact that the social security should be as important element of this comprehensive approach to Ukraine. So understanding that those people who come back from the war, they do not end up fighting another war with their own government, with their own citizens inside the country. We need to look into that already now and prevent that.
Thank you very much, Andrei, and thank you for also bringing a lot of elements forward that sort of people who follow the process for example, Declaration of Lugano can ask themselves. So, you know, where are we going and how are we going forward? Lots has been said, and of course, you know, I have been really rigidly looking at all the speakers who've done brilliantly by squeezing a very complex content in just 4 minutes each. So it's only right that we have 10 minutes for eventual questions, answers, discussions, remarks. So I would like to open to the floor, thanking you once again for coming to discuss the book and to be part of the book launch. If you can just raise your hand. Lubomir, you want to be icebreaker? Yes, please. If you could also say who you are, so just we can get to learn who's in the room.
Lubomir Zaoralek, Masaryk Democratic Academy, Prague. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank for this excellent book, all of you. And I would like to ask Ireneus very shortly, what does it mean, these current tensions between Ukraine and Poland? Does it mean that really Zelensky is not grateful enough, or it is a different fault? What do you think about it?
Ireneus, before I allow you, we will gather the questions. Yes, Maria João, FEPS President.
Well, a few words to say. First of all, that we, FEPS, we are extremely proud that we have conducted this work and coming up with this exceptional book. I would like to tell you that this book was also presented in the Peace Institute in Washington in July by myself when the United Nations Academic Council met. And I had the opportunity to give a copy to the president of this important council, bringing people over the world, and he read it immediately during the flight, and he came back congratulating FEPS and all the authors for the quality of the book. This is the first thing I'd like to tell you. But this is about something which, from my viewpoint, we should have in mind, because we'll go on working on Ukraine. And it happens that the peace architecture of Europe will probably be redefined over the next period, taking into account proposals on the table and the upcoming European elections. This coincides with the United Nations also defining world peace architecture. So this will happen at the same time. And the Ukraine war is at the epicenter of this redefinition. So that's why I really think that we need absolutely to go on working on this issue. This is a comment. Then a question. This is about what can be done by Europe in terms of geopolitical action. From my viewpoint, this is not easy, but should be a smart move from my viewpoint, is to reduce the support given to Russia by Europe bridging directly with China and Brazil, and to put pressure on them in order to prevent a full alignment with Russia. I think this is extremely important in the international chessboard which is being defined, because right now we have a risk of a big divide, and Ukraine again is the epicenter of this big divide. So it's just an idea, perhaps the panel.
Thank you very much. I think it follows also part of the opening questions of painting where we are in terms of changing global map. I'll come back to that, but I still would like to ask if there are maybe 2 more questions that I could take. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Lev Zinchenko. And I have a question concerning the U.S. help and why is the Biden administration is so scared. Like, for example, at the moment, the question of ATACMS, right? Why is Jack Sullivan, why the Biden administration is so scared of providing long-range missiles? And why is it trying to be so theoretical when the question is very much a question of practical solutions, knowing that the elections are coming up? Once again, the question of Trump coming back. And once again, for America, it is much better to give Ukraine arms to destroy Russian army rather than being very strategically, even to some extent scared to provide some of the practical solutions to Ukraine. Why is it so reluctant even now to actually act upon those problematic issues?
Okay, and the last 2 questions, and then I'm closing the floor because I'm mindful of time for everyone.
Thank you very much, Ákos Bencegat from MCC. Thank you for this very high quality ideas. I really appreciate it, and I would like to read this book with a lot of interest. I have a question. Maybe you looked at it already in the book, I don't know, about Europe's population's reaction to the refugee crisis coming from Ukraine, because in the last Eurobarometer survey, I saw that there is a huge support to humanitarian aid towards Ukraine. But in another question, when they asked whether Europe should continue receiving refugees from Ukraine, the numbers were quite lower, were still high, but somehow lower. So it just came to my mind whether there is a difficulty with this question, maybe in Poland or in other countries. I'm coming from Hungary, and Hungary there is a support for receiving refugees, but I don't know whether you looked at this question as well. Thank you.
And there was a lady just in the last row. Yes.
Hi, my name is Helena. I'm from Ukraine. Actually, we're representing the colleagues of Bogdan Ferenc and that you mentioned before. Thank you for this high-level discussion. It was very thought-provoking. My question actually will be about power redistribution. Everybody is talking about that, about the new world order. Where do we find ourselves in 5 years, basing on, like, maybe you can predict some scenarios, basing on the, I know scenarios is always non-pleasure work, but anyway, basing on the outcomes or kind of results of the Russian war against Ukraine, where do we find ourselves in 5-10 years?
Thank you very much indeed. So I have 5 questions, last of which was asked to the entire panel about the predictions. It's a very hard one, of course. I will go with inverted order if possible. Andriy, would you be so kind as to take the floor and react to the questions? And you're at the liberty of choosing, but I have to make sure that the panel answers to all the questions. So while I'm moving on, the narrowing point is going to be there. Andriy.
With the last question, because it's a foresight book that we will publish, hopefully still in September will be out. So there's a lot of discussions on the forecast is used as a methodology to think about what could happen. As a teaser, there's a lot of discussion of growing polarization, militarization, and securitization, even hyper-securitization of the world affairs, which obviously from the progressive standpoint is a big challenge. So we try to look how we can prevent a regressive world from unraveling, also looking at the COVID a number of sort of different crises, plus now the Russia's wars against Ukraine, and sort of the full-scale invasion even tipped over. So I think the best would be to have a look at that book. There's a lot of interesting contribution from different authors, so that will give a much comprehensive answer. So this is my creative answer, and I will just shortly touch on the question of refugees. I think in Ukraine, I really don't like the word refugees being used. I mean, if you define refugees, I think that the number is limited. I mean, Ukrainians do not apply for refugee status. They go. It's a temporary protection directive. That is one. Second, a lot of people, if they stay, this is more of an economic, educational background for children basis. So I think, I mean, because this is a bit of my niche that I work for many years, so it immediately rings a lot of bells in my head. So I think Ukrainians are not a refugee nation. A lot of people would return back. So we need to understand how to define it, but perhaps temporary relocated individuals. So I think perhaps also the narrative spins a bit how the people perceive it, but I wouldn't see it a big problem because again, due to the sort of cultural and language proximity and the ability to Ukraine to enter quickly the labor force in many countries, I think factually that shouldn't be a big issue. I have only sort of small examples where I did some research, talked for instance to people along the sort of eastern flank of the EU, like the Baltic states, where indeed there could be some challenges where you have a small community in Estonia and you have a lot of Ukrainian children arriving, but it's obvious it can happen in any case where you have the newcomers. So there's a lot of work to do, but I think when we speak about Ukraine and the type of sort of the mobility that is happening, we really need to set the vocabulary properly. We need to understand what is happening here. And it's more about the sort of the return of the people, the mobility of labor force, I guess, less in the typical understanding, the definition that we would find in Geneva Convention, etc., about the refugees. So these people are staying, a lot can return. So yeah, so I'll stop on this because not to take too much time.
Thanks very much. Irena, there were some questions directly for you.
There's one question, I think, of Lubomir.
Well, Akos partially as well.
And particularly about the current wave of Polish-Ukrainian tensions. The simple answer would be that, well, we have election campaign, yes, in 2 weeks elections. So, of course, every election, everyone wants to portray themselves as the protector of national interests, that they're doing everything and they're the best. But I think it would be a misleading answer because I think the elections only emphasize the fissures and the problems that there are under the surface in Polish-Ukrainian relations, particularly from the point of view of the National Conservatives. And the National Conservatives always had an ambiguous relation to Ukraine. I write it also about the book because it was, I think, best portrayed in a discussion that I was moderating in Krynica Economic Forum somewhere 2017, where Jan Maria Rokita, an almost prime minister, a very high-ranking figure, close to Tusk, but then very much national conservative, he said something which really shocked me. He said, well, speaking about the integration of Ukraine to European Union, I think it is not in Polish interests. Because now Ukraine, it was already after 2014, now Ukraine is very much anti-Russian, and in our national interest is to keep it like that. Because our national economic interests is not to have a competition for social funds and infrastructure funds to go to Ukraine, because we would become a net contributor to pay for Ukraine. But what we want and what is really matters is a geopolitical competition with Russia, and here we have that what we wanted. Not Ukraine as a bridge, but Ukraine as fighting for the interests of our geopolitical interests, anti-Russian policy. I was very much shocked to that, and of course as a moderator, but I also opposed to that. But I think I think there's something in it. There's still a question that we have not answered as a society: how much of this, let's say, social democratic approach, yes, that we want to border a prosperous nation and developing nation. We want to enlarge the area of freedom, of labor rights, that the Ukrainians have the chance to flourish, yes, in the also European community, and how much of this geopolitics in that. And unfortunately, in the National Conservatives, after 2015, there's much more, I would argue, geopolitics than really such a progressive thinking. For example, none of the National Conservative prime ministers Morawiecki or before him Szydło, during 6 years until the war, they have never visited Kiev. President Duda, on the background of activity of his predecessors, especially Aleksander Kwaśniewski, but also Lech Kaczyński, there were 2 years, for example, 2018 and 19, that he has also not visited Kiev. They have not invited Ukraine to form the Three Seas initiative, although, of course, Ukraine was then associated, or was close to association with the European Union and was also at the Black Sea. So the frustration was also associated with the fact that Poland was not invited to be part of the Normandy format. And Kiev, to a very much large extent, reoriented themselves towards France, towards Germany in big politics, and Poland was sidelined. So this frustration, I think, also now surfaces, yes, that we were very important in the first period of the war with all this refugee assistance, economic assistance, military assistance, and so on. But now, of course, in a natural process, much greater role is played by the US, by Germany, who made the Zeitenwende, yes, and delivers, by France, but even by some other countries. So it's very natural, yes, that's the process of politics. But showing frustration, showing, which some accuse with this all grain problems, which could be solved in the very beginning by simple administrative measures, only shows that still this, yes, this dichotomy, yes, anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, what future for Ukraine, whether progressive or some other, it still matters, and still there are big fissures in that in the Polish society, Polish foreign policy establishment.
Jack.
Why has the Biden administration been so slow moving? It's a fair question.
For Germans, they are quick.
Right, it's all a matter of perspective, right? But no, I mean, this is a fair question, a very fair question that almost everyone has been asking. And in retrospect, it's very easy to say, yes, the U.S. should have been much quicker to deliver HIMARS. The U.S. should have been much quicker to, should have immediately begun training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. Should have delivered Abrams tanks right away. ATACMS is now the kind of the latest, which, and as I understand, they're now there, or in the process of arriving. In partial defense of the Biden administration, I would say they had to be very careful on 3 different issues. One, most obviously, Russia has nuclear weapons. Not only, and it doesn't have a couple nuclear weapons, it has more than any other country in the world. And you don't, I mean, it's easy to say, well, okay, obviously in retrospect, they're not going to use their nuclear weapons, but I mean, they could still use them. We don't know that. So you have to be more careful just because of the nuclear issue. 2 is the Biden administration was worried about the outbreak of a wider war between NATO and Russia. So that's a much, I mean, that's obviously the Russo-Ukrainian war is a big deal, but NATO and Russia is an even bigger deal. So they were concerned about that. And the third point, the third thing they had to worry about is public support at home. These are all legitimate things to be worried about. From the Ukrainian perspective, this kind of gradualist approach, very frustrating. But from the Biden administration perspective, there were good reasons to go slow. And we can say that there is a certain, the logic in this, and one kind of anonymous senior US defense official, he used the metaphor of boiling the frog. You put a frog in water, room temperature, and then you very slowly boil the water. The frog doesn't notice, the frog boils to death. This was this official's metaphor for kind of getting past the so-called red lines that Putin was drawing. If we go slowly enough, the Russians are just, it's become normal for them that these weapon systems slowly but surely, they're gonna get more modern, kind of more destructive. And I mean, it's impossible to prove a negative, but I mean, we can say so far the U.S. and other allies, they've crossed all these red lines. They've done it slowly, but they've crossed all these red lines and managed to maintain, kind of keep the Russo-Ukrainian war, confined to Ukraine right now. Whether that will continue going forward is of course impossible to say. But again, in partial defense, I would say some caution was legitimate. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jack. And André.
Yeah, well, a few comments on the question posed by Maria Joao and by the lady in the back of the room, both about, let's say, global power constellations and how they may develop. It's almost impossible to talk about global politics, regional politics, while the war is still ongoing. Despite that fact, we have to talk about it because it involves our own future. But there are so many unknown unknowns. I mean, leave the unknown unknowns aside. Even the known unknowns make it practically impossible to have an intelligent conversation about the future. But still, Maria Joao said it's not in our interest that India, Brazil align with Russia and create this new line of division. Sorry? China. True. What can we do about it? That was the that was the question which you posed. I think relatively little. I mean, one of the reasons why they realign, to a certain extent against the West, if you like, is because of our Ukraine policy. Is because of our massive sanctions regime and our massive military assistance. And I think that aspect, our Ukraine policy, is more important than these let's say this realignment beyond the Western world. The only thing, and that's also related to the scenario question, the only thing that we can do about it, and here I close the circle, I guess, is when Europe will be truly able to project power in close connections with the United States. I'm positive about that, but still. And that's why I made that very first comment, are we positive or negative about Europe's performance since the beginning of the war? And I said positive, but moderately so. I don't see very many structural changes in how Europe works together or aims to develop its own power as a global actor. It's not really optimistic. I know that FEPS meetings have to end on a positive note. Well, I leave it to the chair.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to supply optimism at the discussion that has been that incredibly complex and telling. I think we started with a question, how do you assess the performance of Europe? And we ended up with a question, but what Europe should do next? What is the expectation? And with that, I think, Laszlo already mentioned we are working on the sequel, on the re-edited version of this volume. There will be further discussions taking place in Helsinki and in Vienna. And I think it's incredibly powerful consortium that is behind with all the organizations and the academics involved in this conversation so far, which gave birth to this 21 incredibly insightful chapters, about 25 minutes of incredibly insightful comments given by the panelists, and a very important conversations that we followed, and that should continue. And with that, I would like to thank everyone, but before I allow you to disband, I would like to give the floor to the second of the two editors, Dr. Uwe Optenhögel, FEPS Vice President. The floor for concluding remarks is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Anja. I'm not going to bore and don't dare to try to do a synthesis of this. I think it's a good example of the rush in which international politics is. What we tried here was quite ambitious, to cover a book with 21 substantial articles in a group like this. But nevertheless, I want to make a couple of comments regarding the debate. The first thing is what becomes very apparent, I think, is that with the start of the war, in the international system, a Pandora box opened to an extent we have not foreseen. And many of the things who were in the box under the lid suddenly surface in light of the war. They were already there, more or less pertinent, but now it all comes out. The next thing, I think, which becomes very, very clear, and was not so clear to us before this war, is that you cannot restrict a conflict and hot war with the participation of a big power to a region. You can confine it militarily to regional fighting, but the conflict is a worldwide, a global conflict. This is also, I think, almost something like a lesson. So a third thing I want to mention goes very deeply into European self-perception. I think the Western Europeans have to acknowledge and admit that before the war, the countries between Germany's eastern border and the Russian western border were nothing more but countries in between. They were countries in between. Not so much the countries who entered the European Union in 2004. They became members of the family, but with a different perception of Eastern policy, like Irenaeus has alerted us to. But the West Europeans, for them, Ukraine was just in between. It was sometimes inconvenient that it was there as a state. And the politics that were done towards Georgia, Caucasus, Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, these politics were a function of our Russia policy. We first thought about Russia, and then we thought about the countries in between. And this, with the war, has fundamentally changed. And I just want to alert all of us that we now shouldn't make the fault that the future Russia policy of Europe becomes a function of our Ukraine policy. Which means that we really have to open up our minds, and the next steps we have to do is, or are, steps of mutual understanding between the Center and Eastern European countries in or outside the European Union and the Old West. Because there's plenty of stuff we don't know about. Yeah, and I think Irenaeus' input here made that very clear. I mean, the Poles, the Baltics, the Slovaks, the Romanians, the Hungarians had a totally different notion of Russia than the Germans, the French, the Portuguese, the Italians, or the Greeks. And we still have to talk about this a little bit among ourselves. So, what happens actually in this very agitated moment of international politics is that we in the West, we realize that our interpretation concepts, how do we interpret developments in the international field, in the global system, they don't work any longer. Because we have BRICS, BRICS Plus. We have G20 in a new constellation. We have a UN battling to reform multilateralism. So there are really plenty, as you said, Andre, plenty of open questions, and which means we should be open to discuss them with an open mind. And the challenge will be to leave our old molds of thinking. Last point. I think what we apparently need is a new Eastern policy. But this time, the Eastern policy has to be formulated jointly and not by the Westerners. As a German, I know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so I think we really need a new Eastern policy, which we jointly have to develop. And there I will only relate to one element which comes into the debate since the war started, which is the notion of Russian imperialism. In Western Europe, I'm not talking about Ukraine, I'm not talking about Georgia, not about Poland, not about the new Eastern member states. In Western Europe, imperialism was a concept which was linked to colonialism and to capitalism. So the center left in the West didn't even have a notion that there was a Russian imperialism always. Expansionist, imperialist. We never discussed it that way. And now that we have to formulate a new Eastern policy, we have to take these aspects into consideration. Because in many of the member states in Central Europe, inside the European Union, they have a notion of what Russian imperialism means. I only give this as an example of a task we may face jointly. So I think to end, I mean, the question is these question about civilizational step back, or where are we in this respect? Do we face a regressive world or international system? I mean, this is the context of the debate, I think. And I mean, if we are pretentious in the European Union, and in Europe, of course, I think we would argue that the level of integration and democracy, with all the defaults the European Union has provided over the years, is a civilizational step. Yeah, it's unique. The question is democracy as a governance system behind that is strong enough to keep it? And that's the task of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Uwe, for those conclusions. As has been said very frequently in this debate, there's a lot of questions open, and I think nobody really targeted this question of 5 years from now. This is something for everybody in this room to think about with so much unknown. And in order to stimulate this discussion, we would like to invite everyone for lunch, where the discussion with the authors, editors, and the representatives of the foundations behind this project can continue. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.